Greetings. In this video, I want to discuss the death of Judas. And as many know, there has long been a claim that the New Testament contradicts itself regarding how Judas died. And that charge is based on Matthew 27 stating that Judas hanged himself, while the popular understanding of Acts 1:18 has that text referring to Judas falling headlong and bursting open. And so those who feel that these two texts contradict each other like to ask the question, how did Judas die? Did he hang himself, or did he fall headlong and burst open? Now, on a preliminary note, the formal logical definition of contradiction is that two or more propositions contradict each other if and only if it's impossible for both to be true simultaneously. Now, different Christians have come up with different imaginative scenarios to reconcile these texts, and even if some of those scenarios seem fanciful, if they're at least possible, that would mean that these texts do not contradict each other, at least not in the formal logical sense of contradiction. But in this video, I want to cover some perhaps less well-traveled roads. You see, we're going to look at an alternative interpretation of the text in Acts, and then we're going to look at an incredible story in the Rabbinic literature, which might have some at least mild relevance. So jumping right in, it should be noted that in the ESV, when Acts 1:18 says falling headlong, there's a note. And when one checks the relevant footnote at the bottom of the page, it reads, or swelling up. This would mean that the ESV is proposing that an alternative reading for Acts 1:18 is that Judas swelled up and burst open. Now, if that were the case, that would seem to be easier to reconcile, right? One might argue that Judas hanged himself, and then at some later time, his corpse swelled up and burst open in, some sort of very horrific way. But some might wish to ask, how did the ESV translators or ESV editors arrive at this alternative possibility, right? What makes them think that Acts 1:18 might refer to Judas swelling up? Well, for that, we need to turn to the Greek text, and we're going to turn to Liddell Scott's Greek-English Lexicon. The text, which is often translated falling headlong, reads in Greek, prenes genominos, right? Which means he was or he became prenes, right? So we're going to turn to the entry for pranes in this lexicon for more insight. And while the relevant Greek term can mean to be prone, which is to say laying face downward, so therefore prenes genominos can mean he became or he was laying face down, the entry notes that in specifically Acts 1:18, when the text says prenes genominos, perhaps it's equivalent to becoming distended, which is to say swelling up. And you may notice there's a portion which reads fort, F-O-R-T. That's short for fortasse, which means perhaps, or it is also possible. So like the footnote in the ESV, Liddell Scott's Greek lexicon is also noting this possible alternative. And we seem to have an ancient witness to this interpretation in the writings of Papias, from back in the early 2nd century, though many might actually miss this even if they're looking at it, especially if they're going by an English translation. So we're going to look at the second volume of Bart Ehrman's compilation of Apostolic Fathers, which he did for the Loeb Classical Library, as this work has a fragment of what Papias wrote regarding the death of Judas. And the account actually runs across multiple pages, with the Greek and English text running from page 104 to page 107. Nonetheless, we can combine the relevant portions from the different pages and have them on the screen all at once. Now, suffice to say, Bishop Apollinaris of Laodicea felt that Judas survived the hanging and felt that what Papias wrote about Judas expands upon what is said in Acts 18. You see, Bishop Apollinaris explicitly cites the words prenes genominos from Acts 1:18, and then he transitions into what Papias wrote. And what Papias wrote is entirely about Judas being incredibly swollen. So swollen, in fact, that he could barely move through a space through which a wagon could fit. So swollen, in fact, that his eyes were swollen shut and, even a doctor couldn't open them. Now, admittedly, the reconciliation offered by Papias and later Apollinaris differs from the one that I offered, right? If you recall, I proposed that perhaps if the text in Acts means that Judas swelled up and then burst, Perhaps Judas died by hanging and then his corpse swelled up and burst, right? But Apollinaris and Papias alternatively believed that Judas survived by hanging, but later swelled up in a shockingly disgusting way and then burst. But either way, the point is that they understood Acts 1:18's words, prenes genomenos, as referring to that swelling. So this alternative understanding of Acts 1:18, which was proposed by the ESV and by Liddell Scott's Lexicon, it's a very old one, and it's an interpretation that stretches back into antiquity, at least as far back as the 2nd century, apparently. Now, having covered that, I'd like to switch gears and look at something completely different, that being the 65th chapter of Midrash B'reshit Rabah. Now, this is a rabbinic text, but before we get into it, I first want to note one of the fanciful reconciliations of Matthew and Acts that I alluded to earlier. See, I remember, this is a personal anecdote, but I remember when I was an undergrad, and this alleged contradiction would come up amongst the students, there were certain students who would make this curious claim that maybe Judas put a sword in the ground with the blade pointing upwards, and then he hung himself over that sword, so that way eventually the rope would snap and he'd fall on the sword and burst open that way. Now, I have to confess, it sounded like crazy talk to me and other skeptics on campus, whether they be Muslim or atheist. You know, this conversation will usually come up amongst Christians and Muslims and atheists. Other skeptics would mock that scenario whenever it was proposed, in part because the Bible doesn't include such details. And in fact, on a funny note, I remember one student even teasingly asked, what is that? Is that some sort of Christian hadith? You know? But nonetheless, while I don't endorse that particular attempt at reconciling Matthew and Acts, I want to keep it in mind as we look at this text from B'reshit Rabah. The portion we're going to be looking at covers the fantastic story of the death of a man named Yakum ish Tzrorot. And that seems rather close to what might have been the Hebrew name of Judas, which may have been or likely was Yehuda Iskariot. For example, Thayer's Lexicon proposed that in the entry for Iskariotes. Now, maybe the mild similarity in name is just coincidental, but I found the similarities in names to at least be mildly interesting. But, we'll keep that in the background as well. But moving beyond that, I want to look at the incredible story this text tells about this man's death. Now, this story is going to strain credulity, right? So I'm not saying that you have to accept this story as historically accurate. On the contrary, I'm advising you to take it with a grain of salt, or perhaps with a handful of salt, right? It's going to be really hard to believe. But you still might find this story interesting, even if you don't consider it historically accurate. Whatever the case, jumping right in, the text says about this man, Hawa rakeb susya, he was riding his horse, or, one day he was riding his horse. Azal kome sharita le mitz talba, along came the hanging beam, or beams for hanging. Now, before I go on, I want to focus on that verb, le mitz talba. The text here actually reads, le mitz tabla, with the bet and the lamed transposed, and this actually gets discussed in Marcus Jastrow's dictionary in the entry for the tzade lamed bet root. And when you're looking at that entry and you scroll down to the portion on Aramaic uses of words from that root, it's specifically the subsection on the Ispael verb stem, it's noted that in specifically this text in B'reshit Rabah, it should read lemitz talba and not lemitz tabla, right? Oh, and one other quick note on this verb, which again is from the tzade lamed bet root. That root is, or words from that root are used twice in Targum Onkelos's Aramaic translation of Deuteronomy 21:22, when that verse refers to a man being hung on a tree or hung on a wooden structure, right? Because etz could mean a tree or a structure that's wooden. Targum Onkelos has titzlo biate al tzaliba, which might more literally mean hanged on an object used for hanging. And that last word, the noun, tzaliba, or tzalib without the definite article at the end, that word tzalib corresponds to the Arabic word for cross, tzalib. And on an interesting side note, a verb from this root was also used in the movie The Passion of the Christ, when the demand is made by the crowd for Christ to be crucified.
Hashkuthak, die
But anyway, getting back to the text, beams were being brought for hanging, and arguably these were beams for crucifixion. So with that in mind, let's continue with the story. And it reads as follows. Amar le, he said to him, Hame susai darbi mari. Look at what my master has my horse carrying for me. Wahame susach darbech marach. And look at what your master has your horse carrying for you. In short, not only were the beams for hanging or possibly crucifixion passing before Yakum, but so too the man who was to be executed on those beams was there as well. And Yakum is mocking him. And then that man responds, Amar le, he said to him, Imkach lamakisao, if such is to those who anger him, the same for those who work according to his will. And then Yakum replies to that. Amar le, he said to him, Asa adam ratzono mimcha, is there a man who has worked according to his will more than you? Right? And this is significant because the man who is about to be executed is recognized by Yakum as one of the most righteous men around, one of the most dedicated servants of God, right? And as the story goes on, Yakum winds up feeling great guilt about the execution of this righteous man, or at least guilt about making light of his plight. And so Yakum goes on to take his own life. So jumping ahead to that, the text states the following. He went and established for himself the 4 deaths of the Beit Din. In other words, there were 4 modes of execution, and he tried to inflict all 4 forms upon himself. So what were those 4 forms? Well, the text states the following. Sakila, stoning. Srefa, burning. Hereg, stabbing, or execution by sword. Wechenek, and strangulation. And then the last word on this page is ma, or what. But to get to the rest, I have to scroll down to the next page so we can continue with the description of what he did. So, including that last word from the previous page, the text asks, Mahasa, what did he do? Then it explains. Habikora ne'atza ba'aretz. He brought a beam and stuck it in the ground, or a beam to be stuck in the ground. Wekashar ba'nima, and he tied a rope to it. And he established wooden structures and then surrounded them with a wall of stones. And then he made a fire before it. And he stuck a sword in the middle of it. And he kindled a fire under the wooden structures which were under the stones. Wenitla bakora, and he hanged himself from the beam. Wenechnak kidmato, and he was strangled before it. Ha'esh nifska hanima, and the fire snapped the rope. Nafal la'esh, he fell into the fire. Kidmato ha'chereb, before the sword, or perhaps he fell upon the sword. Wenafal alau gader, and the wall fell on him, that wall of stones fell on him. Wenishtraf, and he was burned. Okay, having gone through all of that, let's try to offer a summary of what we've seen in the second section of the video. You see, a man with a name somewhat similar to the name of Judas felt tremendous guilt after a man he recognized as righteous was executed. And I should add that the righteous man was executed by a sort of hanging, possibly crucifixion. So anyway, that man who felt that guilt decided to take his own life. He set it up such that he would be hanged and fall upon a sword. And then with the added details that he was also burned and had a wall of stones fall upon him. Now, I'm not trying to build too serious an argument here, but I thought this was an interesting story in light of what I mentioned earlier about certain Christians trying to reconcile Matthew and Acts by saying that maybe Judas put a sword in the ground and hung himself over the sword so that later on the rope would snap and he'd fall upon the sword, right? As crazy as that scenario sounds to our modern ears, it apparently wasn't that absurd in the ancient or early medieval Jewish context that produced Midrash B'reshit Rabah. And might this strange story have some loose connection to the stories about Judas? That idea might sound like a crazy one, but in future videos, I want to cover some other interesting ways that parts of the rabbinic literature seem to line up with portions of Christian writings and the interpretations thereof. But until then, I'll close this video here. At the very least, I hope you found what was discussed here interesting. And, feel free to share any comments or questions or criticisms. I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.